we're really at an inflection point, a time where we've got significant change is occurring, and that change is bringing unprecedented opportunities, but frankly, some unprecedented risks and threats.
Before we get started with the show, here's a quick word from our sponsor, Global Training Center. As trade compliance professionals, you want to make sure that your procedures and documentation are completed as correctly as possible to avoid any delays and possible fines. We provide a range of trade compliance courses that will fit your needs. From in-person or web training to recorded on-demand courses, we can train one or even thousands on your team through your learning platform or on our portal. We can even customize a private session for your team. Go to globaltrainingcenter.com to find out more.
Folks, we're in for a great show for Simply Trade Podcast. Hey, today we have a great show. We're going to talk about some supply chain resiliency and what the Sam Hill does all that mean. I love it. I love it. Hey, Lala, what do you think here?
Well, it's funny because this morning I woke up and the big headlines this morning on TV was the whole world is shut down because there was a little glitch in it. And the good news is, number one, it's not a cyber attack, so good news. Secondly, is everything's shut down because something happened with a update or a patch to a vendor's third party solution to a lot of systems that are used at enterprise type servers. Yeah. And so it shut down banks, it shut down airlines, it's shutting down. It's just a mess right now. But anyway, and I thought to myself, wow, so it's kind of a good segue into what we're talking today. It's not that we're doing cybersecurity or anything like that, but we'll have our guests explain a little bit how there might be a little connection to that. But Andy, you and I have been talking about bringing on government officials and people in the government sector. And because when we do go to these conferences, Andy, we run into, like DHS or CB, they're like, we like to do outreach to the public. And so we've looked for opportunities like this, and we got really, really lucky, like extremely lucky. And we got an assistant secretary to come on our show and talk about their department, some efforts that they're working with supply chain resiliency.
With that, we're bringing on Christa Brzozowski, if I've said that right. And listen, if I haven't, please forgive me, because I can butcher up more people's names. Everybody's like, oh, that's just Andy. Did you just walk in off the street and say, hey, I want to go for this job, or what happened? What's your background a little bit, Christa?
Yeah, sure. Not necessarily off the street, but both old and new in a way. So just recently back to the Department of Homeland Security in their Office of Policy, where I'm the Assistant Secretary for Trade and Economic Security. So that is an existing function that's been around for a bit. I'm new to it in my current capacity, coming on board. What was it? Late November, I guess, of last year. So I've been on board for a while, a few months here, but returning from being with the Department of Homeland Security, really from the beginning. I was fresh out of grad school when I came to the department months before 9/11. So, and technically it was not even the department at that point. So still U.S. Customs Service under Treasury. So I'm one of the original plank holders, I'm proud to say, and have just had an incredible opportunity to kind of grow and mature with the department and sort of see it as it moved through the different stages of becoming a department and increasingly taking on new and diverse missions.
Well, reminding our listeners and all that, one of the things, the whole objective with the creation of DHS was to, obviously we got sucker punched in 9/11. And with that is bringing the agencies together so that there is a stronger communication chain and a stronger, shall we say, a teamwork effort in protecting, obviously, our country and our citizens and whatnot. So there's a lot of things that are going on with that. We're going to be talking today about the supply chain resiliency. So there is a new center that has been set up that I understand is under your purview. The Supply Chain Resiliency Center, is that right?
Yeah. So simply put, the DHS established this Supply Chain Resilience Center late last year. And the idea is that we needed a center to lead and coordinate the department's efforts to, and this is where it gets important, to assess and mitigate potential supply chain disruptions, but also improve our ability to manage actual supply chain disruptions. So it's sort of that twofold mission. You know, I know that that's a pretty broad statement, but I think as I try to explain the core competencies of this new center, it's really to emphasize the fact that we want to be better at predictive analysis, and we want to be better at integrated problem solving. So sorry if that sounds too wonky, but it really, I think, helps us differentiate what it's going to do that's additive to just the broad array of capabilities and experience that we already have within the Department of Homeland Security, and frankly, that we have across the interagency. So maybe it's helpful if I just kind of frame this a little bit and give you a sense if we step back on like, okay, what are the first principles here that kind of drove us to the realization that we needed a center like this? So, principle one is that, I think it's no news to you, no news to many of your listeners here, all professionals in the space, that, we're really at an inflection point, a time where we've got significant change is occurring, and that change is bringing unprecedented opportunities, but frankly, some unprecedented risks and threats. And this has just simply accelerated a convergence of what we've seen coming for a while, which is, convergence of homeland security, these things you had been talking about with like terrorism and drugs, and kind of what the bread and butter of what DHS was originally established, a convergence of that with broader economic interests. And what we're seeing now is this concept and this broader concept of national economic security. So that's sort of framing principle number one. And the second framing principle, as we kind of think about how we wanted to jump into this space with the Supply Chain Resilience Center, is that we've got a history and a legacy of really strong frameworks, and that those frameworks of the past are really still relevant for the frameworks of the present. And I'm talking about things like the need to partner, the need to have advanced information, the need to do risk management. So we've got these frameworks, but what we're trying to do with the center is to sort of ambitiously reimagine those, and aggressively repurpose those. So kind of build upon these concepts that exist, but make them fit for purpose for the future that we're jumping into here. I can give you a little bit more granularity here as when I talk about this inflection point that we're at, and you guys have talked about it on your shows quite a bit, that we're coming out of the pandemic. We saw huge amounts of supply chain disruptions happening there. We're also sort of in an era where climate change, geopolitical tensions, all driving a recognition that we've long had, that this integration of supply chains, of just it's globalization and economies, which has been so great and given us so many sort of great things, has also triggered a lot of upsetting and alarming trends. And that we need to take a look across the way that not only DHS, but the whole Homeland Security and national security and economic security enterprise is set up, and pull the tools that still work, sharpen them up, make new tools if we need them, and have identified areas where, hey, look, we've just got a gap here, and really take a hard look at the authorities, the data, the expertise, and the relationships that we have in the department, and transform that into something that's going to be able to better predict what some of these impacts are going to be, and prepare for them, as well as continue to respond and mitigate them as they arise. And do this all in the context of continuing to deliver on the core missions and the historic missions of security, safety, and of the U.S. and citizens.
All right. With that, let me ask this question: is that as we're going through this, what's coming to mind, and I want to say is like, okay, so I love the fact that you're looking at it, utilizing data for analysis to try and predict. All right, where's a hot spot? Obviously for example, we're all right. Let's kind of review some of the disruptions out there. The Panama Canal has had a drought; it's recovering from that. The frequency of vessels now is moving through the Panama Canal is definitely increasing back to close to normal levels, which is good. The Houthi situation in the Red Sea and the vessels having to go around. I mean, obviously, we're talking a lot about the ocean carriers. We were just talking about where rates right now are skyrocketing out of the China region to the U.S., which is going to be another major cost factor. But with that, the question comes into play is, do you foresee, like the Western ports, congestion in there? Are there now, due to the routing of vessels using the back door, going all the way around and going around the Cape of Africa to the eastern side of the seaboard of the U.S.? Is there a situation where maybe there are port congestion issues there and all that? Container shortages, aircraft and cargoes and different things that you're looking at. Saying all that, here's, I guess, my question that I have is that, okay, let's just say, and I'm going to oversimplify it, let's just take the Western ports, Long Beach, LA areas and all that. Yeah, big hubs. All right. There's congestion. There's ships that are, waiting to get in there. It's like, I hate to be so flippant, but on part of it is like, okay, gee, there's, the southern California ports are congested. What do you do about that? I mean, what is the objective here? Because I know it's taken time to ramp up. So this isn't like, okay, I'm going to get you here. This is a case where I'm like, so what do we do about this?
Yeah, absolutely. And added to the list of sort of potential disruptions that you had detailed there. I mean, look, we've got potential strikes at borders. We have rail closures at our own borders. We've got the potential for cyber events. I mean, and we're really trying to get our arms around envisioning disruptions that are not only going to happen sort of one at a time. Having a cyber attack, potentially, but what a weather event, maybe a health emergency. But what happens if these converge on us? And so that's where we're wanting to do better at sort of predicting sort of concentrations and risks, concentrations of commodities that could then translate into a risk of those not being available for citizens, for the DHS mission, for manufacturers that are critical to producing some of the goods that companies rely upon in the United States. So being predictive and having that analysis so that we're not in the moment responding to each of those things that you had just mentioned, but then also having a structure, an integrated decision-making structure, where we're able to deal with many of those disruptions all at once. And what I mean by that is, what happens if we have that situation that we had at LA Long Beach with containers stacked or vessels sort of stacked outside the port waiting, but maybe on the East Coast a weather event, and maybe God forbid the military is also looking to deploy and sort of pulling resources. And so that it's really at the core of the center, and you're right, we all are just sort of standing up, is to try to put some formal structures in place in the Department of Homeland Security that are going to be able to integrate across the 22 different DHS components where they've got immense data and expertise and resources, but also connect to other centers across the federal government, the Department of Commerce or the Department of DOT's Flows Initiative, so that we're really able to provide our policymakers, I mean, this is essentially a policy function, with the information, the analysis, the options that they're going to need to make informed decisions. And so it's really that distinction of not necessarily being the operational body that's going to rush to put on that reflective vest and head out to the border and sort of fix the problem, but to try to actually get ahead of it. And then as the structure that's been a core mission of DHS's and the U.S. government's for decades to respond to that, to deal with that emergency. We're in the background really understanding, okay, what are the impacts to supply chains? What can we learn from this to be better at predicting it into the future? And how can we put mitigations in place, both to deal with whatever that acute incident might be, but also to reduce the likelihood that this happens again.
What I was going to ask is, what about those situations where maybe we, the importers, might have control over? And I mean, very specifically, I'm just going to go right to the point, is with forced labor. I mean, it doesn't sound like that really falls into the resiliency or anything, but I know it's addressed by DHS, but how does that work into this? Or would it even work into it? Because I mean, technically, we need to be tracing back and finding out if there's forced labor or anything. But how does this work into the program, if it even does?
Yeah, it does, and I think that's an interesting reason why we decided to put this office here at DHS headquarters. We're building upon new authorities that were given to DHS under, I think it was the NDAA from last year, where they're really giving to DHS policy the specific express authorities for economic security, and for bringing additional capabilities, but also structures to ensure supply chain resilience. And forced labor, I view that as sort of a piece of having a resilient supply chain. It is an example of a regulatory regime that has shifted, and as a result, there are requirements across the board for increased transparency into supply chains and an increased appreciation for potential geopolitical risks that could result in what you had thought was a supply chain that was resilient no longer being resilient. And so I see forced labor as really an example of a shifting dynamic and landscape that we're certainly watching at the Supply Chain Resilience Center, and it's sort of feeding into our decision making. Foreign investments is sort of another. It is an area where DHS, among others in the interagency, are constantly assessing information about investments made by foreign entities into U.S. businesses or into real estate that might be right next to a major port. And we're looking at the security implications of those investments. What we don't want is for that information that's being developed as folks take a close look at those investments to be over here on one side. And then on the other side, to have all the great information that CBP has about the goods and the businesses that are coming across our borders to be over here in CBP's ACE. And then to have all of the information that CISA has about critical infrastructure owners and operators and risks to be sitting over here. And then to have all the information that ICE has about bad actor networks and counterfeiters and folks that are moving drugs in and out to sort of be sitting over here. We really want to pull all those signals into sort of a centralized framework or a centralized hub, and to be able to then draw even better conclusions about where the risks are, and then so that's the predictive analysis piece, but then also have the structures in place to do something about it, to be able to empower our decision makers to look across the full set of authorities that DHS has and realize that a problem identified by customs at the border might have a solution that requires FEMA to do something, or Coast Guard to do something, or a completely different agency to do something. And so we really are trying to take a model of not only pulling from all the DHS components and making sure we've got access to their authority, their expertise, and their data, but that we're then empowering the decision makers in DHS and across the U.S. government to figure out how to proactively put in place mitigations or to have sort of a broader, deeper set of tools to use if something does happen.
Let me ask this question, though, is that as you're looking at it, one of the things I'm not hearing right now, and I don't know if there are plans for this, maybe it's just assumed that it's happening, is input or boards or groups from the private sector. For example, leadership from all the different ocean ports, leadership from the different transportation companies, things of that nature. So as you're seeing something, and I'll give you a good example. Here's one of the things that comes into play is, all right, my first question is there, private sector involvement? And secondly, let me give you an example of, I know that there was an issue with during the pandemic, the Western ports were struggling. There was such a congestion. And surprisingly, California was not allowing 724 operation of those ports. And the Biden administration had pushed to get that, and supposedly those ports were opened up to allow 724 operation. The unfortunate was the unions didn't respond, nor did some of the other operations around there. I can understand you can't turn that on a dime. I get that. But I mean, it really, they never really did create a third shift, if you want to call it that, and whatnot. And so is that something that you would be able to deal with, to say, hey, look, hold these folks accountable to try and deal with getting more vessels or more cargo moving?
Yeah, I think you're maybe the easiest way to address that is to first of all, to your question of the private sector engagement. Like, absolutely, that's going to have to be critical. Right now, we're a growing team, and we are relying upon inputs that we're getting from the private sector, directly, largely educational. Us telling them about what the Supply Chain Resilience Center is, what do we want it to be, and trying to get input on sort of, okay, what should it be? What are the problems it should be tackling? But we're largely, for formal structures, relying on sort of the just vast array of existing, FACA committees or other types of advisory committees that, we've got dozens of them just across DHS, and pulling some of those relevant inputs through that structure. So we've got that educational output, pulling formal input through existing structures, and we'd love to grow and evolve that. And to meet sort of that particular problem set you just mentioned. I mean, that problem set of a policy decision being made by the White House, but needing to orchestrate that across, scores of government agencies, and that just are the ones that have authorities at the border. The operators, the vessel carriers, the port authorities, and then the staffing from both the private and the public sector side. That's really, I think, where you see a lot of these supply chain disruption centers coming, where the White House is building upon sort of the existing structures where departments and agencies have their authorities and their missions and their roles, and they do that. But then the pandemic happened, and you had a whole lot of things happening at once, in super fast time. And you needed more flexible structures to be able to give decision support to leaders, and engage with the private sector, and run analysis of like what's going to work and what's not. And so, past is prologue in many ways here, where the experiences that I had working, with CBP and with the interagency, and setting up something like the U.S. Single window, the International Trade Data System, and we put in place sort of a structure, the Border Interagency Executive Committee, and the idea then was to first try to digitize important export documentation so that we could just be more agile in making decisions about processing at the border, just in regular times, but there's applicability to times of disruption that we're talking about now. So that was the analysis part, but take that back 15, 20 years. And then the integrated decision-making part was this structure, the BIEC, where the idea was, look, we can have all the best information in the world and have it moving quick, super fast. But if we all still disagree on kind of the decision, it would be great if, as you had said, parts of the government or only the government is ready for 24/7 operations, and a critical part is not. It brings everything to a standstill. So when I say past is prologue, we're building on those structures that had worked. That we needed to be more agile and moving goods across the border by digitizing it. But we're just taking that into the next step of we need to be more agile by not only digitizing all this information and having these structures in place, but now, applying things like no conversation is complete without AI, applying AI and machine learning to really fast track this and give us the ability to not only make sense of the current environment, but make better sense of the future environment, and then look across the range of authorities that DHS has and says, okay, I see, a geopolitical risk here that is resulting in X, Y, or Z. So let me play out a couple of policy scenarios and feed those to my decision makers around how could we be more flexible and reroute cargo if we're anticipating a border closure, or if we are seeing a convergence of a hurricane, a cyber attack, and maybe a health incident. Tee those scenarios up to our leadership and do that in a way that we're doing it with the DHS leadership and then the interagency leadership and the White House leadership as well.
Well, and taking that a step further is that if you're seeing your predictive analysis here, seeing some trends or some possible, say, hotspots, the geopolitical thing comes to mind is right now is China's sword rattling with Taiwan and that situation. And there's a lot of things going on with that. And of course, then the other side is, the Russia situation and their subs in the Black Sea and different things. All right. So as all that is going through, the other question would be, in part of DHS, are you also reaching out to the military? So if there are actions or potential actions, whatever, is there a cause and effect discussion going on at the time?
Yeah, I mean, and that is really a core function of let's say FEMA in the case of DHS in particular, where looking at DPA or Defense Production Act. I mean, we've got these muscles, but we just haven't exercised them in a while. And so as we are looking at an increasing, this, as I said, this connectivity, this globalization, where we've now got our domestic security sort of integrated into economic security, we are looking very closely now at, what happens if there does need to be a deployment, but at the same time, we're seeing this is in fact one of the big initiatives that we just had, where the ship-to-shore cranes that are responsible for offloading and bringing in and out, all these containers, are there vulnerabilities? Are there cyber or physical vulnerabilities associated with a core piece of the overall ecosystem? And that's where we, sort of the playbook, if you will, of the Supply Chain Resilience Center was to understand, largely from feedback that we had received from sort of folks that were using this equipment and engagement with the Department of Defense, who also rely upon these things to put goods on their ships if they're deploying, and to assess, well, wait a second, if this is a key node here, we're going to assess the whole supply chain, and here's a key node, here's a key capability, maybe it's a key commodity. What happens if? And then run some analysis And we realized, like, wow, that could be a really bad day if either one or a network of those cranes go down. And so then we looked across the capabilities that the DHS had to put in place to mitigate that. And the best tool immediately was authorities under the Coast Guard to require, put sort of cyber hygiene requirements in. And so that's a play that we're hoping to repeat time and time again, of identifying that threat, figuring out, where the applicable tool is within DHS, or pushing that up to the out to the interagency or up to the White House, and building on these core missions of CBP and FEMA and CISA and Coast Guard and TSA. So the folks that are actually sort of doing the investigative work are using sort of the systems to be the detectives and to find the bad stuff. We want to take all the signals that are arising from that work and be able to now look forward and draw conclusions about this happened or this is happening, and therefore what might happen.
As we're needing to kind of wrap this up, here's a question for you that, as we're looking at this, and this may be a little different because most, government, I can't, promote this or whatever, but basically is like, what are some things that, the public, if you will, or the private sector could do to help your center and help yourself? In particular, I'm thinking if there are people that have some ideas that would like to submit some things to you or whatever, what can we do to help you?
Yeah, I'd love if you, I'd love folks to be reaching out to me and my team directly. We are very much in the taking ideas on board stage. We're piloting a bunch of new capabilities to just figure out what's out there in the commercial space for sort of AI analytics and whatnot. Our big goal here, we've got a really interested team, folks that were actually at the created things that I think that was called the U.S. Digital Services at the time. So sort of these bringing tech experts from the private sector to help DHS really try to be at the cutting edge of innovation. And we've got those folks that had created U.S. Digital Services now as like our chief technology officer. We've got Secretary Mayorkas, so he's really excited about the potential to lean forward and use these systems in a new and innovative way. So we'd love ideas about how we can better integrate across the DHS mission space, and do that using technology, using AI, using new sort of mechanisms and ways to just integrate with the private sector. And we also, that's sort of piece one, integrating across the DHS mission space. But it's really imperative that we rethink the way that we're able to integrate both in just talking, sharing information, and having networks with the private sector, but frankly, having common understanding of sort of signals, demand signals, and sort of what emerging disruptive trends look like. And maybe that's a piece of technology. Maybe that's the utilization of AI. Maybe that's just a better sort of network of relationships. I think we can go old school as well as like looking into the future to figure this out. But those are the areas where we're really looking for the best and the brightest ideas from everyone, including the private sector.
Well, listen, thank you so much for being on our show. I hope we get to do some more of these, especially as we start getting into maybe a little bit more detailed on what's going on with the center, how it's going through, some of the challenges that you're up against. Feel free to, anytime you want to come on or have somebody come on with us, we'll be glad to talk about the issues and hopefully get you some more support.
That sounds fantastic. And, as we come up on our 1-year anniversary in a little bit here, maybe that's a good time to reflect back on what we've done and also come with some ideas about what we're doing.
Yeah, it'd be great to, hey, if you want to do an anniversary show for your center and all that, it's like, here's where we're at, let's go forward. So let's talk about that. Share this show, like it, please subscribe. All that to say, folks, hope you have a great day.
Thank you very much for joining us. Simply Trade is brought to you by the generous contributions of Global Training Center. You can follow the show and GTC on LinkedIn or Twitter and other social networks. Make sure you check out the show notes in the description for a full rundown of today's show with all the important links. Also, make sure that you share this with a friend and subscribe on your favorite streaming platform. We really like hearing from you. If you enjoyed the show, make sure to rate and review wherever you listen to this podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest on the show or would like to sponsor Simply Trade or suggest any topic you would like for us to discuss, please contact us via email at simplytrade@globaltrainingcenter.com, or you can DM us on Twitter at simplytradepod. Thank you again for the privilege of your time. Happy trading. Simply Trade is not a law firm or an advisor. The topics and discussions conducted by Simply Trade hosts and guests should not be considered and is not intended to substitute legal advice. You should seek appropriate counsel for your own situations. These conversations and information are directed towards listeners in the United States for informational, educational, and entertainment purposes only and should not be substituted for legal advice. No listener or viewer of this podcast should act or refrain from acting on the basis of information on this podcast without first seeking legal advice from counsel. Information on this podcast may not be up to date depending on the time of publishing and the time of viewership. The content of this posting is provided as is. No representations are made that the content is error-free. The views expressed in or through this podcast are those of the individual speakers, not those of their respective employers or Global Training Center as a whole. All liability with respect to actions taken or not taken based on the contents of this podcast are hereby expressly disclaimed.